So let me just mention, for those of you who haven't been here and so forth, just to know where we're going. So on the front page of your handout, kind of tells you where the groups will go. So after I finish the lecture to kind of begin stimulate some ideas with us, we've got three to four groups, depending on which four groups really for you to choose from. So the youngest group, those in their people in their 20s or 30s, and again, these are all you pick the group you want to. Like we're not going to be any group police here. 20s and 30s, typically people who are single or married but have no children, are going to be in the church library, which is right behind me. So go through that door and behind there, and there's your meeting room. For those who maybe in their 30s and they have young children, preschool, elementary, they're in the young adult classroom, which is up there, catty corner. And those who are kind of young-ish, young adults with children maybe in middle school, high school, maybe even you already have one in college, they're going to be in the Stephen Ministry Classroom, which is up in that corner. And if none of those ideas, you like any of those, Coram Deo, which is an ongoing Sunday school class, is meeting right up there, and they'll be happy to have you as well. So hopefully between all those four choices, you can find some place that you will find a community and have some time to talk about. So, and as usual, at the end of the lecture time, I'll take any clarification questions that you may have, but it's really more about kind of what was not clear that I shared with you, or maybe there's a piece of scholarship you are wondering about, but it's not really to discuss the ideas mentioned. That's what your small group is for. So, if you got a quick question like that, happy to do that, make myself a little bit clearer, and then but the meat time for the discussion is really for your group to kind of work out stuff. And then hopefully at the end of your times, you will also have a time of community, how's everybody doing, and then prayer time before you dismiss around 10:30. All right, all sound good? Last week I mentioned that when we finish all this process, two things. Next week, we are having a special whole weekend thing, spiritual growth weekend with Guy Sales, who is a previous interim pastor here at Fifth Avenue. And so Guy's going to be back all next weekend. And so next Sunday, this group will not meet. All the adults from 18 through 80 something and above are going to be in the Fellowship Hall for Sunday school. So we will not do our thing here next week. We'll do that. We'll pick back up 2 weeks. And our last 3 sessions in April will be on Jesus' parable, 3 of Jesus' parables. So in all of this will end at the end of April. Our experiment will end. And I asked you last week, we're kind of looking at 1 or 2 options to do our picnic and kind of evaluate how things are. And one would be to do it on the last day of this experiment, the last Sunday in April, or to do it June 1st, the first Sunday in June. Does anybody have a preference on that? If you prefer April 27th, raise your hand. If you prefer June 1st, raise your hand. All right, nobody prefers that. All right, so we'll see. And most people didn't vote, so I'm assuming for most people don't care. Okay, we'll work out a plan and probably see if we can do it then on that April 27th. And we'll either do it here on a campus and meet outside and have some time with the kids to play and so forth, or we'll go to a park somewhere. We may have to wait. We make the decision late, depending on what the weather looks like at the end of April. So, anyways. All right. So let's begin our lesson today. So this is the last of our series of classes on David. And so as with the other cases, this story is told from 2 different perspectives. So in this story, there's 2 different versions. There's the one in Kings, because this is the first chapter of Kings. And this story, I must tell you, is a bit cringy, messy, and ends in a bloodbath. This is not Vacation Bible School material, right? None of you have ever read the story when you were 6 years old, 10 years old at Vacation Bible School. Chronicles, the Chronicles version, which was written 300 years later, is the G-rated version. And while Chronicles version is more proper, let's be honest, the sanitized version is a bit boring, right? But let's get into the 2 versions and kind of give you some things to talk about in your small groups. So the book of 1 Kings open up with this transition story from David to Solomon. That's why we've switched from Samuel to Kings. And the first words of the scene, and you can flip on to the second page of your handout, it gives you the Bible verse. The first words of the scene set the tone. King David was old and advanced in years. Now this writer loves and admires David. and yet tells the story in a somewhat pathetic way. David's health is failing. His advisors think that the best way to restore him and to restore his vigor is for him to have sex with a beautiful young woman. Okay? So they go out and search in the kingdom for the most beautiful young woman they can find, and they take Abishag from her family and bring her to David. And her job as a teenage young girl is to snuggle up to the old king and to, so to speak, bring some life back into him. Like I said, this is cringy stuff for our 21st century ears. Might have been cringy back then too, but that's not the way things work. This plan, however, doesn't work because David is impotent. So Abishag becomes his nursemaid / concubine. Okay, now that we kind of put all that out there, let you start digesting some of that. The writer then switches on in the story to what's also happening in other places in the kingdom. David's oldest remaining son, Adonijah, is starting to put things in motion that will make him king once David dies. And he infers that David's silence, notice how the phrase is written there in that passage, he infers that David's silence, which of course may be nothing more than his declining health, he infers that David's silence is permission to keep going the way he's going. And so he enlists the top leaders of his father's kingdom. Joab, who we met last week in the story with Bathsheba, Joab was the general who took the troops out for battle while David, who's getting a little thick in the waist, stayed back in Jerusalem. Joab was the commander of the army, the general of the nation's army. So Adonijah links up with Joab and also with Abiathar, who is one of the two high priests in the kingdom. David had two high priests during his reign, Zadok and Abiathar. So Adonijah is doing the right things. He's lining people up to support his kingdom. But not everybody is on board. It mentions in the passage that Zadok, the other high priest, and Benaiah, who is the commander of David's personal mercenary army, and the prophet Nathan do not support Adonijah's claim to the throne. So the author is telling his very story. People are choosing sides, okay? So on the edge of Jerusalem, Adonijah begins performing rituals publicly that stake his claim to the throne. He invites his younger brothers and other royal officials to the ceremonies, but he noticeably does not invite Nathan, Benaiah, along with Benaiah's warriors, and his brother Solomon. Soon, Nathan and Bathsheba begin a counter plan. Bathsheba enters David's chambers and encounters Abishag. Now, we could spend a long time digging into that encounter, but I don't have that much time. You all might want to wonder about that and talk about that in your groups, because Abishag is Bathsheba at another moment in time. Okay? She was taken from her family like Bathsheba was taken from her husband. And that Abishag is brought to do sexual favors for David to bring life back to him. But Bathsheba is a different woman now. She is the one with power in the relationship. David is feeble and dying. She is young and cunning. And maybe most importantly, she is beloved by Solomon. So she gets David to declare that Solomon will be king. Nathan the prophet, Zadok the priest, and Benaiah, the commander of David's mercenaries, are all enlisted to have a public ceremony that anoints Solomon as king. The cheering and the music is so loud at Solomon's ceremony that Adonijah's camp hears the roar. Now, notice in the passage, I think I got that red highlighted. Yeah, at the bottom of the page. That everybody knows the roar is so loud that Adonijah's camp hears it all. And flip to the next page. Notice what they say. As they all hear what's happening, they ask, why is the city in a roar? And they are told that David has made Solomon king. Verse 49 says, then all the guests of Adonijah got up trembling and went their own ways. They understood what this meant. You now had two men dueling to say, I'm going to be the king when David dies. But David has given his blessing on Solomon. And they know what's going to happen. In chapter 2, which I don't play out for you, but if you want to read it for your own enjoyment, get into the nitty-gritty of the story. Solomon consolidates his power. He has his half-brother Adonijah killed, which this is the interesting part of the story. At first, Solomon says that he's going to keep his brother alive. Adonijah, after this moment, he runs to the place. They don't have a temple yet, but he runs to the tent where they keep the Ark of the Covenant. And he grabs a hold of the Ark of the Covenant. Because surely they will not assassinate him when he's holding on to the Ark, right? The horns of the Ark. Horns actually don't touch the Ark, but anyways. So Solomon says, because you are here, because I'm one with God, I will keep you alive. Sometime later, Adonijah goes to Bathsheba, and he asks Bathsheba, would you go to Solomon and ask him if I could have Abishai as my own? Now, again, you all will talk about that a lot in your groups, but the fascinating piece is that Bathsheba, people know that if you have to ask Solomon a tough question, you go through Bathsheba. So that tells you where her place in the power, the one who had been taken from her husband and her family, now has survived and has found her own place of power in the story. That is worth talking about in your groups. But Solomon, of course, is incensed, that to give away one of his concubines, because he got his father's concubine when he becomes king, to give away one of his concubines would be like giving away the kingdom. And so he decides it's time now to kill Adonijah. And so he makes sure somebody assassinates him. And then soon after, he makes sure that somebody assassinates Joab, who was the commander of the army, who was going to support Adonijah. Abiathar, he decides not to assassinate a priest, but he exiles Abiathar to the town of Anathoth. And so this all bloody bath, all the whole story kind of ends in this big bloodbath. There's the beautiful transition from David to Solomon, according to the writer of Samuel and Kings. Now, this G-rated version in Chronicles, which you see pieces of in the bottom half of your page there, begins with a single sentence in chapter 23. And this single sentence really is just announcing the whole section of the chapter, okay? This gets a little confusing. Some scribe later on, by chapter 29, says that Solomon was made king a second time. That was an addition late. We see the old text and know that it was added late because they didn't understand that the first statement in chapter 23 is just saying, this is the name of the section. Solomon will be king. And what happens over the next 5 chapters is David puts his kingdom in order so that when he dies, it'll be ready for Solomon. And one of those things is to start building the temple. However, God tells David, you can't build the temple because you have killed others. You have done things that I despise, and so you can't build the temple. Solomon built it. But chapter 28 and 29 tell us about how David did all these things to get the temple ready, so that in Chronicles, all Solomon does is to carry out his father's plans. That's what he does. Very different than what it was told in Samuel Kings, which was all Solomon's doing. So by the end of chapter 29, before all the people, David then prays a long blessing to God on behalf of all the people, and he also prays God's blessing upon Solomon's rule once he becomes king. The chapter and the book of First Chronicles ends with Solomon's coronation and David's death, and all of Solomon's brothers are in attendance at his coronation. And they all fully support his rule. The contrast of these two stories could not be greater. Let's just peg these up for a moment before you go to your groups. In Kings, David is a feeble, impotent old man who is maneuvered by Bathsheba to secure her son on the throne. In Chronicles, he is an aging, beloved sage who offers God a deep and abiding prayer for all the people in his last act as king. In Kings, Adonijah and Solomon are in a fight to succeed their father. Adonijah makes the first move, but he is undercut by Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan, and ultimately Solomon ascends to the throne. In Chronicles, Adonijah is never mentioned in the story. Neither is Bathsheba. In Kings, once Solomon ascends to the throne, he takes vengeance upon all those who sided with Adonijah, making sure that he kills Adonijah after his brother, his half-brother, asked for Abishai. Then assassinates Joab and then exiles Abiathar. In Chronicles, none of this is mentioned. Instead, it claims all of Solomon's brothers attend his coronation and everybody supports his rule. These stories push us to ask an important question for these days, living in our country right now. Does it matter how we tell our stories? Does it matter how we tell our history? That's up for debate right now in our country. And here you see this dialogue going on in ancient Israel as well. All right, I hope I've given you some great things to think about. I want you all to head to your groups and have your discussion time and end with your prayer time. Thanks so much. Oh, I didn't ask. Did anybody have any questions? Anything wasn't clear? All right, have a great discussions.